Chapter 1: The Seed of Joy. In a peaceful village, hidden deep between rolling emerald hills and a sparkling river that shimmered like silver under the sun, there lived a young woman named Elena. The village itself was a place of simple beauty, where the fields stretched wide and the air was fresh with the scent of earth and wildflowers. Life moved slowly here, with the seasons dictating the rhythm of each day. People rose with the sun, worked the land, and returned home with the fading light of dusk. The villagers were content, yet often preoccupied by the daily challenges of their modest lives. Elena was not known for wealth or status. Her family was neither noble nor rich. In fact, her home was one of the humblest in the village, a small cottage with a thatched roof and a garden where wild herbs grew freely. However, Elena was loved by all who knew her. What set her apart was not what she owned, but the abundance of kindness she offered to everyone she met. Her heart seemed to hold an infinite capacity for compassion, and her radiant smile could brighten even the gloomiest of days. From a young age, Elena had felt a deep connection to the people around her, sensing that true happiness didn't come from what one possessed, but from the bonds shared with others. She believed in the power of small acts of love and saw beauty in every person, no matter their circumstances. This belief became the foundation of her life, and her kindness, like sunlight filtering through the trees, touched everyone in the village. Every morning, Elena would rise before dawn, just as the first golden light began to stretch over the hills. The village, still asleep, was quiet and peaceful at this hour. Elena would dress quickly, tie her long dark hair back, and step outside into the cool morning air, eager to begin her day. Her heart was light, for she found joy in the simplest tasks. Her first stop would always be at the home of her elderly neighbor, a widow named Marta, who struggled to fetch water from the village well due to her aching joints. Marta lived alone, her children having moved to distant villages to start families of their own. Elena would gently knock on her door each morning, and without a word of complaint, she would carry Marta's water jugs to the well, fill them, and return them to her grateful friend. Marta's eyes would glisten with gratitude, and Elena's smile would grow wider with each kind word the old woman spoke. From there, Elena would move through the village like a quiet, compassionate force, helping wherever she was needed. She would offer her hands to families struggling with their morning chores, carry heavy bundles for the blacksmith's wife, or soothe the cries of a child who had scraped their knee. Her touch was gentle, her words comforting. To Elena, these small acts were not burdens but opportunities to bring light into the lives of others. In her eyes, kindness was not a chore but a gift that brought joy not only to those who received it, but to herself as well. Despite the many hours she spent serving others, Elena never seemed tired or worn out. Instead, her energy seemed to grow with each task she completed. People began to notice this about her. She had very little in terms of material possessions, yet there was a radiance about her, a quiet contentment that seemed to defy the hardships of life. Even though her own home was modest, and her meals were often simple, consisting of little more than bread and vegetables, she was always cheerful, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. Many in the village, curious about her endless happiness, would often ask her, "Elena, how can you be so content when you have so little?" For most of the villagers, life was a constant struggle for survival. Every harvest was uncertain, every winter came with the fear of hunger. They had learned to guard their possessions carefully, holding on to every grain of wheat, every bit of firewood, afraid that if they shared too much, there wouldn't be enough left for themselves. But Elena was different. she lived with an open heart, and she was always willing to give, even when she had little. Whenever someone asked her about the source of her joy, she would smile softly and say, "Joy is like a seed. It grows when it is shared, and the more I give, the more it blooms within me." Her words intrigued the villagers, but many couldn't fully grasp their meaning. How could giving away what little you had bring more joy? For them, joy was something you held onto, something you protected, much like their food and possessions. But for Elena, joy was something that flowed freely, like the river that ran through their village, nourishing everything in its path. Elena's wisdom was simple, yet profound. She had discovered a secret that few in the village understood, that true wealth was not measured in gold or grain, but in the love and kindness one shared with others. To her, the act of giving was not a sacrifice, but a way to multiply joy. Each time she helped someone in need, she felt her own heart grow lighter. Each time she offered a smile or a comforting word, she felt her spirit soar. Her life was a testament to the power of this simple truth. Though she had little, her heart was rich, and her happiness was abundant. Elena had learned that in the end, it wasn't what she kept for herself that mattered, but what she gave to others. Her joy came from knowing that she could make a difference in the lives of those around her, even in small, everyday ways. The villagers watched her, some with admiration, others with disbelief. How could a person give so much and still seem so full of life? For them, life was a careful balance of survival, a daily calculation of what could be spared and what needed to be held back. Yet Elena seemed untouched by these fears. She gave freely, without hesitation, trusting that the universe would provide for her in return. And somehow, it always did. As the seasons passed, Elena's kindness continued to ripple through the village, touching the lives of everyone she encountered. Though the villagers still didn't fully understand the source of her joy, they couldn't deny the impact she had. Her presence was like a warm breeze on a cold day, a reminder that even in the midst of struggle, there was always room for love, always a reason to hope. Elena had planted a seed in the hearts of the villagers, though they didn't yet realize it. That seed, her belief in the power of kindness, would soon grow into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 2: The Drought of Despair. One year, without warning, disaster struck the peaceful village. The rains, which for generations had nourished the land, failed to come. In the early days, the villagers waited, hoping that the delay was temporary, that soon the clouds would gather, and the familiar sound of rainfall would return. But as the weeks turned into months, their hopes slowly began to fade. The sky remained a relentless blue, the sun scorched the earth, and the once lush fields that had fed the village began to wither and die. The river that had once flowed freely, winding its way through the heart of the village, became little more than a thin, sluggish stream. Where children once played by its cool banks and villagers gathered to wash clothes or collect water, there was now only dry, cracked earth. The crops, without the life-giving water they needed, shriveled in the fields. Corn, wheat, and vegetables, essential staples, turned brown and brittle under the oppressive heat. The trees that had once been full of fruit stood bare, their leaves curled and dry. Even the animals seemed to sense the village's growing despair, for they no longer roamed the fields and hills. The cheerful sounds of birdsong disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. With each passing day, the villagers grew more fearful. Without water, their food supply dwindled. The lush greenery that had surrounded the village now seemed a distant memory, replaced by dust and desolation. The people, once full of laughter and warmth, began to change. Fear crept into their hearts, gnawing away at the sense of community that had once united them. In times of plenty, it was easy to be generous, but now, as hunger and thirst loomed over them, many began to turn inward, retreating behind the walls of their homes, guarding what little they had left. Doors that had always been open to friends and neighbors were now closed and locked. Conversations that once echoed through the streets were replaced by silence, as families huddled inside, afraid to give too much, afraid that tomorrow would bring even greater hardship. As the drought worsened, so too did the tension among the villagers. They began to blame one another for their misfortunes. Whispers of jealousy and accusations of greed spread like wildfire. Why does their well still have water, some would ask. Why do they have more food than us? Fingers were pointed, friendships were broken, and the once close-knit community began to unravel. However, in the midst of this growing despair, one person remained unchanged, Elena. Despite the drought and the mounting scarcity of food, Elena's heart did not harden. She refused to let fear dictate her actions. Even as the land dried up and the river shrank, Elena continued to wake early each morning, just as she always had, and make her way through the village, seeking out those in need. While others hoarded their bread and water, afraid of running out, Elena shared what little she had. If a neighbor's well had run dry, she would offer them water from her own bucket. If a family was too weak to gather firewood, she would carry it to their door. And if a child cried out in hunger, Elena would quietly slip them a piece of bread, even if it was the last one she had. Her actions puzzled many. They could not understand how she could give so freely when she had so little. Some even scolded her, warning her that she needed to think of herself, to be more cautious. "Elena, you can't help everyone," they would say. "If you give away all you have, what will be left for you?" But Elena would simply smile, her eyes filled with a quiet certainty, and reply, "The drought may take the water, but it cannot take away our hope. What we give to others comes back to us in ways we cannot see." She believed in the power of kindness, even in the face of scarcity. And though she too felt the pangs of hunger, though she too worried about the future, she never allowed these fears to close her heart. Instead, she trusted that the love she gave would sustain her, that even in the darkest of times, there was always enough to share. One day, as Elena made her way along the banks of the river, which by now was little more than a muddy trickle, she noticed an elderly man sitting alone beneath a dry, withered tree. His clothes were worn and tattered, and his face was etched with deep lines of sorrow and exhaustion. His shoes were falling apart, barely protecting his feet from the harsh ground, and his hands, resting on his knees, trembled with weakness. He looked so fragile, so defeated, that Elena's heart immediately went out to him. Without hesitation, she approached the old man. "Are you hungry, sir?" she asked gently, her voice soft and full of compassion. The man looked up at her, his eyes dull and tired, but when he saw Elena's kind face, a spark of life seemed to flicker within them. He nodded slowly, too weak to speak, his gaze falling to the small piece of bread she held in her hand. Elena didn't think twice. Though that piece of bread was the last bit of food she had, she knelt beside the man and offered it to him with both hands, as if it were a feast. "Here," she said, "take this. It's not much, but it will give you strength." The old man accepted the bread with trembling hands, his eyes shining with gratitude. He took a small bite, savoring the taste, and as he ate, he looked at Elena thoughtfully. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice hoarse but full of warmth. "Why do you give when you have so little?" he asked, his gaze searching hers. "Most would have kept that bread for themselves." Elena smiled softly, her eyes filled with a quiet joy that seemed to defy the drought and all its hardships. "Because giving is what fills me," she replied simply. "I've learned that true abundance doesn't come from what we hold onto, but from what we share. When we give from the heart, we are never truly empty." The old man studied her for a moment longer, his expression shifting from one of disbelief to one of deep understanding. His eyes, once dull with despair, now gleamed with something unexpected, hope. He nodded slowly, as if he had found the answer he had been searching for all along. "You have a heart full of light, my dear," he said quietly, his voice growing stronger. "And it is in such hearts that miracles are born." Elena looked at him, puzzled by his words, but before she could ask what he meant, the old man stood up. Though he had seemed so frail just moments before, there was now a strength in his posture that took Elena by surprise. He smiled at her, a smile that seemed to hold a deep, ancient wisdom, and with a simple gesture, he turned toward the river. Something extraordinary began to happen. Before Elena's astonished eyes, the ground beneath the man's feet softened, and the faint trickle of water in the river suddenly swelled. What had been a mere stream moments ago grew into a rushing flow, the riverbed filling rapidly with cool, clear water. The dried-up earth around them, once cracked and lifeless, began to change as well. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the soil, and the air, which had been hot and stifling, now felt cool and fresh. It was as if life itself had returned to the land in an instant. The old man smiled at Elena one last time, his eyes twinkling. "You see, dear one," he said softly, "the miracles we seek are often found in the love we give." And with that, he vanished, leaving Elena standing by the river, overwhelmed with wonder and awe. The village, once consumed by fear and despair, would soon witness a transformation beyond anything they could have imagined. Chapter 3: The Miracle of Kindness. With a wave of his hand, the elderly man stood up, his frail frame now upright and strong. His worn and tattered clothing no longer appeared as the garb of a tired traveler, but radiated with an unseen power, as if he carried within him a deep connection to the earth and sky. Elena, who had been kneeling beside him, watched in awe, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Behind the old man, the river, which had been reduced to a mere trickle, began to stir. The faint murmur of water grew louder and more persistent, like the whisper of an approaching storm. Elena stood up, her eyes wide with wonder. She could scarcely believe what she was seeing. The river, long dry and nearly forgotten, was coming back to life. At first, it was a slow transformation. The thin stream of water widened, then deepened, as fresh, clear water gushed from beneath the ground, swelling the riverbed. The sound of rushing water grew louder, echoing through the valley, as if the earth itself was awakening from a deep sleep. The villagers, hearing the commotion, rushed to the riverbank, their hearts filled with disbelief and hope. Mothers called out to their children, fathers hurried from the fields, and even the elderly, who had been too weak to leave their homes in days, came out to witness the miracle unfolding before their eyes. They gathered along the riverbank, staring in astonishment as the once parched stream turned into a vibrant, flowing river, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. The water, crystal clear and fresh, flowed with a strength and purity they had not seen in months. It was as if the river had never suffered the drought, as if all the hardship had simply been washed away by the rushing current. Tears filled the villagers' eyes as they knelt by the river to drink, cupping the cool water in their hands, savoring its life-giving taste. Some splashed it on their faces, laughing with relief. Children ran and played along the river's edge, their joyful cries filling the air. The drought had taken so much from them: food, water, hope, but now, in a moment of unexpected grace, everything was being restored. As the water flowed, the withered fields, too, began to respond. The ground, once dry and cracked, softened and turned a rich, dark brown. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the soil, as if reaching toward the sky in celebration of the returning water. Plants that had seemed dead and gone began to stir with life. Crops that the villagers had long written off as lost began to revive, their leaves unfurling, their roots drinking deeply from the newly replenished earth. The fields, which had once stood barren and lifeless, were now a sea of green, vibrant with the promise of renewal. The villagers, still dazed by what they were witnessing, looked to Elena. They remembered her kindness during the worst of the drought, how she had shared her food, her water, her hope, even when it seemed there was nothing left to give. They had seen her offer the last piece of bread to the old man, unaware that they were standing on the brink of a miracle. Now, as they watched the river flow and the crops spring back to life, they understood that Elena's generosity had been the key to this transformation. The elderly man turned to Elena, his face glowing with a serene smile. The villagers, sensing that this man was no ordinary traveler, gathered around, eager to hear his words. He looked at them kindly and then spoke, his voice filled with wisdom that seemed to resonate deep within their souls. "Your kindness, Elena," he said, "your hope and your love have brought life not only to this village, but to the earth itself." Elena, still overwhelmed by what she had witnessed, looked at the man with wide eyes. "But I am just one person," she said, her voice soft with disbelief. "How could my small actions cause such a change? I did nothing more than offer what little I had. How could that bring water to the river and life to the fields?" The old man smiled warmly, his eyes twinkling with understanding. "Never underestimate the power of a heart that gives," he replied. "You see, true miracles don't come from grand gestures or mighty deeds. They are born from small, selfless acts of love, from moments when we choose to give despite our own need. When you shared your joy, your hope, your kindness with others, it took root in the hearts of those around you and grew beyond anything you could have imagined." He gestured to the river and the fields. "The water, the crops, they are not just a gift to this village. They are a reflection of the love that flows within you, Elena. The more you gave, the more that love grew, and now, it has brought life to everything it touches. This is the miracle of kindness. It multiplies, it nourishes, and it brings light even in the darkest of times." The villagers stood in silence, their hearts full of awe. They looked at Elena with newfound respect, understanding now what she had tried to teach them all along, that abundance does not come from hoarding or holding on to what we have, but from sharing what we can, even when it feels like we have nothing to give. In those small acts of generosity, they had witnessed a power greater than any they had ever known. From that day forward, the village was forever changed, not just because the river had returned, but because the people themselves had learned the true meaning of abundance. Inspired by Elena's example and the miracle they had seen, they began to open their hearts to one another once more. The doors that had once been closed in fear were opened again in friendship. Neighbors shared what they had, no longer worrying that it wouldn't be enough. They helped one another with the harvest, shared their food, and gave freely of their time and kindness. The village, once a place of fear and scarcity, became a place of joy and connection. The spirit of giving blossomed in every corner of the village, as people realized that the more they gave, the more they received in return, not in material wealth, but in the richness of their relationships, the strength of their community, and the warmth of their hearts. Elena's story spread far and wide, becoming a legend that was passed down through generations. It was told not just in their village, but in neighboring towns and distant lands. People spoke of the young woman who had brought life back to the earth through her kindness, of the village that had learned that true abundance comes from sharing, and of the miracle that had transformed their lives forever. And though Elena herself remained humble, never seeking praise for what she had done, she knew deep in her heart that the elderly man had spoken the truth. The real miracle had not been in the river or the crops, but in the hearts of the people. The miracle of kindness, once planted, had grown and flourished, creating a legacy of love that would endure for all time. As the seasons passed, the village continued to thrive. The river flowed steadily, the crops grew in abundance, and the people lived in harmony. They never forgot the lesson they had learned, that in times of hardship, the greatest gift one can offer is not wealth or power, but kindness, a seed that, when planted in love, has the power to create miracles.